Radio Show.
I want to thank everyone for tuning in today to the 25th Hour Radio Show. I am your host, Rob Fairless, and on the phone with me today is retired Army Major Jeff Struecker, who is currently the lead pastor of Calvary Baptist Church in Columbus, Georgia. Jeff, thanks for taking time out of your day to join me on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.
So, Jeff, I traditionally start off the show giving the listeners a little background information about the day's guest. Now, as far as your military career, you've played a dual role as soldier and chaplain. So let's start off with your military career. What was your initial inspiration to volunteer to be a member of the United States Armed Forces and the Army in particular?
Well, I think the first thing I was doing is just looking for something to do after high school. I was a senior in high school when I enlisted, and I didn't really have any military experience in my family, so most of it was just I didn't have a whole lot of job opportunities. I grew up while I was living in a small town in the Midwest, and some of it is I just wanted to challenge myself. So those two things are really what steered me toward the military. But I did have a friend that joined a month or two before I did, and his father served in the Navy in the Marine Corps. And when I started considering joining the military, he kind of gave me some advice about what to do if I was going to end up in the military.
Now, you ended up earning the title of Army Ranger during your enlistment. I mean, you were involved in some very dangerous battles. Now, were you feeling a calling to be a witness for Christ before you joined the military, or was it something you experienced while serving that kind of brought that out?
Well, yes. Before I even joined the military, I had a passionate faith in Jesus Christ, and I felt called to make sure that people knew about my faith. And at no time did I really ever see a contradiction between what I believed and what I did in the military. So I tried to be pretty active about my faith and think that I did that, as God gave me the opportunity.
So when did you decide to become a chaplain while you was enlisted?
Yeah, so that's the question I've been asked probably more than anything else. God called me into the ministry when actually the day after the big battle in Somalia. Your listeners may know that I was a sergeant in Mogadishu during Black Hawk Down, and as I just said, I had a really strong faith in Christ. So I tried to live out my faith while I was in Somalia, and frankly, for part of the time there, I was fairly convinced, part of the time that I was in Somalia, I was fairly convinced I'm going to die. And God gave me absolute peace about death. So when the battle was over with the next day, I had a bunch of my friends who I had been trying to talk to about my faith, but they just weren't really willing to listen. Well, before this big battle, the day after the firefight was over with, a bunch of those guys started coming up to me and asking me questions about my faith. And most of them really wanted to know how was it possible that I didn't have the kind of fear of dying that everybody else had. And I had the chance of sharing my faith in Jesus with a lot of people that day. And I didn't really hear an audible voice from God. I've never really heard God speak in an audible voice, but this is about as close as you can get to an audible voice. Of hearing God say, Jeff, this is what I want you to do with the rest of your life, is share, your faith with warriors who are about to go off to combat, and some of them may not return, and they're not ready for eternity.
You kind of answered my next question. I was going to ask you when I first made it public to family and friends that I gave my life to Christ. I had a few people that fell out of my circle, of friends, just because they were either atheists, thought being a Christian wasn't cool, etc. For whatever reason. Did you experience losing some friends who, you mentioned people coming to Christ. Did you lose some friends as well when you became a Christian?
Well, my friends knew where I stood with the Lord. I tried to make that known to them. But when I felt called to ministry and I started telling them that, there was a lot of people talking about it, and frankly, they were asking. They were confused because they didn't grow up in church circles, so they were saying stuff like, I think Jeff's going to go be a missionary. And I said, I didn't say missionary, I just said ministry. A bunch of them saw me kind of as freak at that point. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
okay, it's one thing just to believe it, but it's a whole other thing to go throw your military career away to go follow after, to go do something like this.
Yeah.
And most of them were saying, why on earth would you do that? And I understood it. It wouldn't make sense to most people if you didn't share the common faith that I had. Why, a call from God into ministry, why I would be willing to forsake everything to go follow that call.
Now, what's it like being a chaplain in the military as compared to serving as a civilian pastor? Is there a big difference there as far as duties are concerned?
Yes and no. Frankly, military chaplains are asked to do a lot of what the average pastor on the street is asked to do, but there are some differences. For example, it's probably a better analogy to think about a military chaplain like a missionary, because they really do live in another culture. The people that they serve with speak a different language. The acronyms in the military, if you're not in the military, it's almost impossible to keep up with. They wear different clothes and they eat a specific way in a specific time, and the military can be so regimented that it's like a foreign country. So certainly there's some counseling and there's some teaching and there's some preaching and all of those things that go along with it, but that are true of being a civilian pastor in a church and being a military chaplain. But I usually didn't use the word pastor to refer to myself. I tried to use the term of like missionary. So I think that may be the better analogy there.
Yeah, yeah. Now, as far as Calvary Baptist Church in Columbus, where you're at right now, what made you pursue working in ministry there?
Well, I just retired from the Army, and I knew it was when I retired from the Army that I was going to go to the local church. I mean, I felt like God had called me to preach and teach for the rest of my life. So I had been living in Fort Benning, Georgia, and that's, the neighboring community to Columbus. My family and I had become members of Calvary Baptist Church for a long time before even retiring from the Army. We just fell in love with this church.
Now, has your experience as a military chaplain rolled over into your civilian role? I mean, has there ever been a time when that has played to your advantage when ministering or evangelizing to someone?
I hope, I believe it has. I hope folks that work with me would say it has. So Columbus is or Fort Benning is a huge military base, and Columbus is a military town, which means almost any pastor has some military folks and their families in their church. And some of us have a lot of military folks and a lot of their families in our church. So obviously I can relate. I spent almost 23 years in the Army. And my wife and I, that's really all we knew before stepping into the role in this church. So obviously I can relate to those military families that come to our church, and I can speak their language. That, I think, is an immense help. But also I understand how they think, which helps me relate to them on levels that maybe a pastor who's lived in our community for a long time but never had any military service, maybe I can help think the way a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine might think through a problem than the average pastor. So I think those things kind of give me an advantage.
Now, do you ever have like young adults coming to you with questions about joining the military?
Yeah. Yes, often. In fact, I just had a dad asking me yesterday at lunch, hey, my son's considering joining the military, and I would love to talk him out of it, but he didn't really say it that way, but kind of got that impression. And I said, hey, I'd be happy to talk to your son if he has any questions about the military. I'd be happy to do that. So, yeah, that happens a lot.
I bet. Now, for those out there listening, Jeff is also an author on top of being a pastor. He's wrote a number of books. How many books have you written so far, Jeff?
I have 5 in print, 1 nonfiction, and then 4 in a series of fiction books that I've written.
Now, for someone listening right now who might be interested in purchasing one of your books, which one would you suggest to introduce them to your work?
Well, my life story, this nonfiction book, is called The Road to Unafraid, and then the fiction books are all written so that any one of them could be read without having to read the rest. You don't need to know what's happened in the book before it to pick up a book and to follow right along. So if you haven't heard my story by The Road to Unafraid, if you've heard my story and you're interested in a fiction book, pick up any one of those fiction books.
Now, do you have any books in the works right now, or any other projects you might be working on?
Yes, I have one more fiction book that I'd like to write to finish this series out. The publisher hasn't really, I don't think that thing is going to go through with the publishers the way that I'd like it to. So that one may be something that we have to do self-publish on. But I'd also like to continue to write to men specifically. That's really the audience that I feel called to write books to, and specifically challenging men to be the kind of godly leaders that God has created them to be.
Awesome.
So I still got some ideas there, but none of them have really started to make it to page yet.
I got you. Now, are you a big social media guy? Do you have a preferred online presence people can find you hanging out on more than others?
You can find me on social media, but I don't hang out on social media at all. So I'll spend about 30 seconds a day on social media, and that's about it. People want to contact me, they can always find me on, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're trying to get people to check out your church as well, right? Calvary. Does Calvary have their own website?
Yeah, CalvaryMinistries.com is kind of the overarching website for all of our ministries, and then our church's website, you can find it through there.
Okay, so before we wrap things up here, is there anything you'd like to say to the listening audience that maybe I didn't cover, like any final words?
No, well, I guess I would like to say I've had two distinct privileges in my life. One of them is to serve my country, and I spent basically my entire adult life doing that. And then God has now given me the second great privilege. And by the way, I love being around warriors. They're my heroes. So not just serving in the military, but having the privilege to serve with some of those guys, it's an honor, guys and gals. But the second thing is now the other great privilege is to be able to serve my King. And by that I mean King Jesus. So I feel like God has given me two dreams. I've had the chance to do the dream of a lifetime twice, and I'm thrilled to be able to do what I'm doing right now.
Well, Jeff, it's been a pleasure having you on the show today, sir. I'm gonna pray for you, and I wish you nothing but the best moving forward in your ministry for our Savior.
Thanks so much.